The Smart Boy Who Averted a Blood Libel. In the middle of the month of Shvat, in the year 1737, there disappeared from a small village near Lyazna a small Christian boy. The Jew hater Nikolaev, together with his friend Kozitsky, jumped at this opportunity of making trouble for the Jews by charging them with having kidnapped the missing boy in order to kill him and use his blood for their Passover. The Jews of Lyazna were terribly distressed at the turn of events and called a meeting of the heads of the Jewish community to discuss ways and means of refuting this horrible and baseless libel against them. Young Chaim Shimon, whose head was full of all sorts of plans as to how he could help the Jews in their plight, decided he must find a way of being present at the meeting. He knew, of course, that they would never allow him, a young lad, to stay and listen to their discussions, so he sneaked into the meeting hall just before the meeting was due to begin and hid himself behind the oven. The atmosphere of the meeting was very grave. Each one put forward his suggestion, one saying the only way to save themselves was by bribing Nikolaev. Another recommended bribing the state authorities. Perhaps they ought to try to convince their civic head of their innocence, but they were afraid that he would more readily believe Nikolaev and Kozitsky and the false proofs they would bring than their own pleas of innocence. They could arrive at no solution which they felt would be strong enough to save them. They fixed a day for all the Jews of the town to fast and pray to God. Chaim Shimon, cramped in his hiding place for the several hours that the meeting continued, decided he must do something independently. First of all, he made the acquaintance of a clerk, the local office of the city administration, so that he would know what was due to take place there. He learned that Nikolaev and Kozitsky were planning to visit the local governor on the following Friday evening, obviously to present their charges against the Jews. Knowing that all the Jews would be staying at home on Friday night, they chose this time so they should not be seen by them and tried to forestall them. Chaim Shimon also learned that in addition to the local governor, there were to be 4 others present when Nikolaev and his friend came. One was supposed to be amicably inclined towards the Jews, another the reverse, and the other 2 were neither one thing nor the other. On that particular Friday evening, a terrible snowstorm raged. After the Shabbos meal was over, Chaim Shimon suddenly got up and told his parents that he must go to a friend's house, as he had something of importance to discuss with him. He warned them that the storm might prevent his coming back, so he would spend the night at his friend's house, and they were not to worry. They accepted his words in good faith, little dreaming what was going on in the fertile mind of their offspring. During that day, Chaim Shimon had met his new friend, the clerk, and had pushed some money into his hand, and had asked him to help him get into the city hall that evening, as he wanted to be there when Nikolaev and Kozitsky would make their charges to the governor. But he did not tell the clerk the reason why he wanted to be admitted. So the clerk jokingly asked him, "Perhaps you want to be converted? The priest will be there too if you do." Despite the heavy storm, Chaim Shimon set forth with firm steps and a determined look in his eyes. When he arrived at the city office, he received a setback. His friend the clerk was nowhere to be seen, and the attendant at the door turned a deaf ear to all his entreaties, and just refused to let him in. Chaim Shimon obstinately continued with his pleading, so the attendant simply took him by the collar of his coat and threw him out. Chaim Shimon was made of sterner stuff than to be thus discouraged. Seeing light shining out of 2 large windows at the side of the building, he made his way towards them and looked in. They obviously belonged to the room where the meeting was to be held, and sure enough, there was the governor with several other officials sitting at the table, and there too were Nikolaev and Kozitsky. Chaim Shimon felt he must act quickly so as to prevent them working their mischief before it was too late. So, climbing onto the window ledge, he began banging on the window with his fists and calling out in a loud and pitiful voice that he was freezing and would they have pity on him and let him in. He made such a noise that they heard him even through the double windows. They all looked at each other, wondering what all the noise was about. The governor called the attendant and asked him to admit the person who was calling from outside the windows. The attendant said it must be the boy whom he had just evicted for being a nuisance, but the governor insisted nevertheless that he bring him in. The attendant had no option but to obey, and so Chaim Shimon was brought into the presence of the governor of Lyazna and his associates as he had wished. Chaim Shimon, with his graceful appearance and beautiful eyes expressing honesty, steadfastness, and determination, made a very favorable impression upon the people assembled there, with the exception, of course, of Nikolaev and Kazitsky. These two were furious that this bit of a lad should have chosen to make his untimely appearance just when they were about to bring their charge with the evidence to support their blood libel against the Jews. Just like his Jewish impudence, burst out Nikolaev. Chaim Shimon kept silent, but threw him a look of scorn and disgust, which made the anti-Semitic Nikolaev blink and turn away. The priest, who was present, thinking here was a golden opportunity to catch a convert to his Catholic faith, turned to Chaim Shimon and, looking around, said, "After all, we must give the Jews their due and not belittle them. They are exceedingly quick-witted and clever. If they had a mind to, they could easily come over to our faith and make very good Catholics." Here was the time for him to say something, thought Chaim Shimon, so he replied, "The Jews are always ready and willing to accept the truth from whichever source it comes, for they love the truth. But they also expect others to accept and recognize the truth and make the same sacrifices for it as they are prepared to." Nikolaev was absolutely incensed, for he realized that Chaim Shimon had come to put a spoke in his wheel, and it infuriated him to think of such a bit of a lad getting the better of him. "You cursed Jew!" he bawled at him. But ignoring Nikolaev, the governor turned to Chaim Shimon and asked him in a gentle and friendly tone, "Tell me, my boy, what has brought you here?" Greatly encouraged, Chaim Shimon replied, "I have come here to tell you, who are anxious for the truth, what I heard this person," pointing to Kazitsky with his finger, "saying to that one," pointing at Nikolaev, "this morning. I shall also tell you what he replied." Everyone looked at Chaim Shimon in astonishment. What would he say next? They listened in growing wonder as he told them how he had taken it upon himself to shadow the Jew-hating pirates Nikolaev and his friend Kazitsky since they began spreading false stories about the Jews, and particularly now that they had libeled the Jews with having kidnapped the missing Christian boy. Nikolaev and his friend looked at each other as if thereby they would find some inspiration and know how to deal with the unexpected turn the matter had taken, but nobody took any notice of them. All eyes were focused on Chaim Shimon as he spoke up in a clear voice without any trace of fear. "Don't keep anything back," the governor said to him encouragingly. "Tell us everything you have heard these two men say to each other." And Chaim Shimon only too readily complied, repeating every word for word and in detail what the two conspirators had been planning against the innocent and defenseless Jews. "This morning," continued Chaim Shimon, "as I walked noiselessly and unobtrusively behind the pirates Nikolaev and his companion Kazitsky, I heard the latter say to Nikolaev, 'When we go before the civic heads this evening, see that you speak clearly and convincingly so that they will be impressed with the truth of your words.' To which Nikolaev replied gleefully, 'Don't worry, my friend. I feel confident that my story will ring true, and that I can put the case so that none will even dream that I have made it all up out of my own clever brain. Incidentally, friend Kazitsky, I stand to make a pretty penny out of this affair, for I'm sure the Jews will come scurrying along with their bribes in their endeavors to appease me.' As Chaim Shimon told his story, everyone listened with eager attention, but Nikolaev and Kazitsky could not hide their astonishment at the way the Jewish lad had learned of their plot. The others, the governor and his associates, felt somewhat confused. What should be their next step? The only one who seemed undisturbed was Chaim Shimon, who stood there erect and confident. The first one to break the silence which followed Chaim Shimon's narrative was the governor. "Tell me," he said to him, "why did you not immediately come to me and report what you had heard?" "I was hoping that they might, after all, not carry out their threat," replied Chaim Shimon in a clear voice. "But when I came here tonight and saw they were here, I realized that I had no alternative but to reveal them to you for the troublemakers that they are." The two troublemakers suddenly awoke to the fact that they had better say or do something to falsify what the boy had just said, and began vehemently to deny that there was any truth in what he had said. They even suggested that the Jews of Liozna had probably put him up to coming to the governor with this fantastic story so that the civic heads would be prejudiced against them. At the same time, the two schemers outrivaled each other in hurling curses and abuse at the Jews in general, and at Chaim Shimon in particular. Chaim Shimon stood by, unaffected and unmoved. He replied so calmly, "As it happens, nobody at all knows about my coming here. Not even my parents, as I didn't want them to be worried about me. I decided on my own initiative to take up the matter, feeling that the truth must surely emerge, so that you, the responsible heads of the community and its welfare, would seek the truth and find it." Chaim Shimon spoke so simply and sincerely that his listeners could not but be impressed by his words. The governor told Chaim Shimon to wait in the big waiting room while he and the priest went into a private room to consider the matter. Suddenly, the pirates and his friend burst in on Chaim Shimon with murderous looks in their eyes, pounced upon him, ready to tear him to pieces. But Chaim Shimon was quicker than they, and as they sprang towards him, he eluded them by jumping onto a bench, and so from bench to bench until he reached the door and the safety of the next room, where the three remaining members of the council were sitting, waiting for the return of the governor and the priest. Nikolaev and Kazitsky, however, were so infuriated that even here they did not hesitate to attack the lad. They took him off his guard and began striking at him with their fists. Chaim Shimon, however, was no weakling and did not take it passively. He gave Nikolaev such a blow that it sent him flying full length to the floor, and as he fell, he struck his head on the bench, which sent blood streaming from his nose. Kazitsky came in to attack, but Chaim Shimon jumped onto his shoulder from the bench where he had sprung, and putting one arm around his neck in a stranglehold, pounded with his other fist into Kazitsky's head. Chaim Shimon gave him a good beating before jumping behind the three members of the city council, keeping them between himself and his two attackers for safety. Nikolaev and Kazitsky were rendered helpless, and on top of everything, they realized how they had failed to catch their prey and had themselves gotten a beating instead. They would have tried somehow to retrieve their lost dignity by retaliating against the boy, but at that very moment, the governor and the priest re-entered the room, having heard of the commotion and wanting to know what it was all about. Nikolaev and his friend boldly asserted that Chaim Shimon had attacked them when they came into the waiting room for a drink. Chaim Shimon denied this, saying the opposite was the case, and asked that the attendant of the waiting room, as well as the three members of the council who were a witness of what had taken place, to be asked for corroboration of his statement. But after half an hour's investigation, the governor and the priest said they had come to the conclusion that it was not proved who had started the fight. Their decision, therefore, was that the three of them who were involved in the fight should all be whipped. Nikolaev and Kazitsky to receive 20 lashings each, and Chaim Shimon, being a boy, to receive 15. The governor ordered them into the blind room, a room without any windows, where the whipping was to take place. He also called for the official whipper, Jan Rus, to prepare his whip, which was composed of long, thin, and smooth reeds, which bent easily as they were swung out. When everything was ready, lots were cast as to which one should be the first victim to be bound to the bench for whipping. The lot fell on Kazitsky, who immediately began to tremble with fright, for it is a well-known fact that all bullies are cowards. Nikolaev also looked terrified, but Chaim Shimon looked on calmly, showing no sign of fear or weakness. As the keepers began binding Kazitsky, he struggled fiercely, but all he got for his trouble was a few extra blows, for they did not intend to stand any nonsense from him. They pulled off his clothes, roughly and unceremoniously, wrapped him in a large wet sheet, and tied him to the whipping bench, ready to begin the whipping as soon as the order came. Before Jan Rus and his attendants were to begin their job, a clerk came forward with pen and paper and asked the trembling and terrified Kazitsky if he had any confession to make. He tried to put on a brave face, declaring that he had nothing to confess. Then the music started. At a sign from the governor, Jan Rus set to with a will. Kazitsky yelled with pain at every lash, and at the sixth he could bear it no longer and begged them to stop. He was ready to talk. Jan Rus lowered his hand and laid down the whip as the clerk again came forward with pen and paper, asking Kazitsky what he had to say. It was obvious that he was only telling half of the story, so the order was given to continue with the whipping. Kazitsky just writhed and squirmed. The sheet was torn to shreds and stained with the blood which had spurted from his many weals and wounds. When the clerk, who was doing the counting, came to the 14th lash, Kazitsky made a feeble sign indicating that he was prepared to confess. Haltingly and gaspingly, he told them that Chaim Shimon had told the truth, and that all he had said was just as it had happened. The clerk took down each word as he uttered it, and then asked him to sign the confession. Koziski could barely hold the pen in his trembling fingers as he wrote his signature, and having done so, closed his eyes from sheer weariness and pain. Having finished with Koziski, Nikolai was brought in. When he saw the horrible state that his friend was in, lying there on the bench, groaning with pain from his blood-stained wounds, he shuddered and paled. He knew that Koziski had made a complete confession, but he thought he would protect himself by saying his friend had told lies, as well as the Jewish boy, but he, Nikolaev, was telling the truth. But immediately came the order for him to be whipped. Janus tore his clothes from him and bound him to the whipping bench, while the clerk stood by, counting the lashes. Nikolaev rent the air with his screams of pain, and at the 18th lash, he yelled for Rush to stop, indicating that he was prepared to make his confession. The clerk brought his pen and paper and wrote down what Nikolaev was admitting, namely, that Chaim Shimon had told the truth, but that he and Koziski had lied, though he spoke in such way as to imply that Koziski was more to blame than he himself. Both Jew haters were now dragged off and thrown into jail, where a strong guard was set to watch that they did not escape, though in their present condition, sore, weary, and bleeding, it was hardly likely that they would undertake any attempt at escape. Chaim Shimon naturally was told that he was cleared of any charge, he was free to go when and where he pleased. In view of the terrible storm still raging out of doors, he asked permission to be allowed to spend the night in one of the rooms at the city council offices. His request was granted, and he retired with relief, not merely because his own innocence was recognized, but because the Jews of Lyuzhna would now be saved from the awful charge and danger of the false blood libel. Next morning he returned home in time to accompany his father to the synagogue as on every Shabbos morning. As they hurried along, his father did not even think of asking what had happened, taking it for granted that his son had spent the night at his friend's house. Little did he dream what adventure the boy had had, and what a hero he had emerged. Chaim Shimon davened with his usual concentration, and there was nothing in his attitude which could possibly arouse comment. The matter might have been left as it stood, unknown to the Jews of the town, had not one of the heads of the Jewish community happened to meet on the following Sunday one of the men who had been at the city office on Friday evening, and who reported the exciting story of how a young Jewish lad had ousted the two bullies and Jew haters, Nikolaev and Koziski. A couple of days later, the leaders of the Jewish community received an official letter from the governor asking them to present themselves at the town hall, where they were informed what they had already learned from the man on Sunday. They were asked to find out who the young hero was and to bring him to the governor, as he wished to see him again. Everyone now heard about the false charge that had been framed by Nikolaev and Koziski, and how the Jews of Lyuzhna had been saved from a terrible fate by an unknown Jewish boy. The leaders of the community were, in any case, very anxious to find the person whom they owed perhaps their very lives. But now that the governor was asking for him, it was imperative that they find the boy without delay. Chaim Shimon gave no indication that he even knew who the boy was, and certainly gave no hint that it was he himself who was the hero they were so feverishly seeking. The situation was becoming extremely tense when the Rav announced in shul that the boy, whoever he was mistakenly hiding his identity. His continuing to keep his secret, even from the motives of modesty, was in this instance a crime against the Jewish community. He begged this unknown person, therefore, to make himself known without further investigation. Chaim Shimon, seeing he had no alternative, went up to the Rav and told him that it was he who had been at the office of the city council on Friday evening, and had the good fortune to be God's instrument in saving the Jews of Lyuzhna. The following day, the heads of the community, accompanied by Chaim Shimon, presented themselves to the governor as requested. He patted the boy on the back and praised him for his great courage, self-confidence, and heroism. He ordered that a further whipping of 25 lashes be administered to the wicked Nikolaev and his ill-starred friend, Koziski, for insulting him and his friend, the priest, by attempting to invoke them in their lying plot against the Jews. The governor called a mass meeting for all non-Jews and made Nikolaev and Koziski declare publicly that they had made up the story that the Jews had kidnapped the missing non-Jewish child with intent to murder him and use his blood for their pacifier. They had to declare that the Jews were innocent, and that, in any case, it was not true that Jews required Christian blood to celebrate their Passover. At the same time, the governor took the opportunity to warn everyone not to dare lay a hand on a Jew. He said Nikolaev and his friend would pay with their lives if any harm came to the Jews of Lyazhna. He asked all honest and decent Christians to ally themselves with the Jews in the event of a possible attack upon them by some unruly and irresponsible citizens. It is easy to imagine the great joy that swept through the Jews of Lyazhna and how they acclaimed Chaim Shimon as the hero of the hour. It was then that he earned the nickname Chavat, which stuck to him from then on.